So we are now recording. So again, if you missed my little promo announcement, this is the Crop Maintenance and Pest Management Urban Gardening Workshop. Welcome, hopefully you're in the right place. I think I have seen most of you on Zoom, but if not, my name is Ellie Perry. I'm the Sustainability Manager for the Office of Sustainability at Cal State Dominguez Hills. Welcome to our session. The Office of Sustainability runs facility services operations for the campus urban farm, who I also represent today. And this fun little workshop is really designed to focus in on tools, tips, and tricks to kind of help you be a better urban gardener. So to that end, I hope you enjoy yourselves today. Before I get started, I did want to make a couple housekeeping announcements. So again, welcome to our workshop. As we go along, you might have questions. So if you do have them, please feel free to type them into the chat box as we go. I have my lovely assistant, Chloe, actually monitoring the chat box, keeping a note of all the questions that come up. And we will have time at the end where we will be covering Q&A for anything that's come up during the workshop. And on top of that, I did also want to give a quick thank you to Shell for donating the funds to help support these community workshops to the campus urban farm. So did want to recognize their donation in terms of offering this programming to you all. So hopefully you'll find this useful and fun. So to get started, today's workshop, we are going to be covering the topics at hand, which in terms of the agenda, we're first going to talk about identifying problems in your garden, because that's usually the first question we get. You know, something's eating my plants. I can't figure out why this plant's not doing well. So hopefully our techniques will help you in that regard. And then we'll move into kind of rectifying those problems when it comes to maintaining your plants. So really looking at the things that you can control as an urban gardener in terms of right plant, right place, kind of science behind watering, how to prune. And soil is actually a very important topic when it comes to raising healthy plants. And it's so important that it actually has its own workshop. So join us again, not next week, but the week after, if you want an in-depth look at how to maintain healthy soil for the purposes of having healthy plants. And then we're going to go into the stuff that you might not be able to control as much, which is more pests and problems along those lines. So things that are eating your plants, things that are causing your plants to go haywire, and kind of how do you deal with that when it comes to pest management. So hopefully you'll get a lot out of this workshop. So let's dive in. So first off, when you have a problem in your garden, how do you identify that, right? So there's two major categories when it comes to maintaining your garden, when it comes to problems. So with your plants, there are problems resulting from just improper care, which is, you know, if you know what you're doing, you can fix that fairly easily. But there's also problems resulting from things that are a little bit outside your control. So those are external factors, abiotic and biotic, which just basically means like non-living problems and like actual alive things like pests and insects and things like that, which we'll get into more in depth. So don't worry, we'll revisit that idea. And when it comes to tools for identifying problem, obviously this workshop is designed to help you with that. We also have a wide variety of videos up on our Farm Skills videos playlist and our docent program, which is also available on our website, which provides, you know, very in-depth workshops on all of these different topics. And you can find us on our YouTube channel at CSUDH Sustainability. So feel free to check us out there. And just as an FYI, in terms of, you know, there is no magic, like, you know, knowledge when it comes to identifying like pests and plant problems. Pretty much everyone nowadays uses Google. So even professional gardeners, if you tell them like, hey, there's a problem with these holes in the leaves of my plants or something's coming up, everybody uses Google. It's actually an amazing tool. You have the internet. So it's actually a really, don't be afraid to use it to go figure out, you know, the checking on the symptoms, right? Like, hey, my plant's doing this, what's happening? Using the Google image search results to kind of try to find a picture that looks similar to what's happening to your plant. That's a totally legitimate way of figuring out how to deal with pest problems or plant problems in general. And generally, if you're doing Google search, if you're refined by the type of plant that you're having, like, hey, I'm specifically concerned about my tomato plant, or, you know, like my rosemary or whatever you're actually having issues with, you'll generally get better refined results to figure out what's going on with your plant when it comes to problems. And when it comes to problems that you control, so things that problems that are resulting from improper care or the way you're managing your plants, there's basically only 4 things that plants really, really need. So they need adequate sunlight. And when you don't have adequate sunlight, you have too much, you have too little, that's what causes problems like wilting and sunburn and lack of production. Water is also very important. So if you have too little, it starts wilting, getting curling leaves. If you put too much water, then you start getting mildew and mold problems. And air, not just kind of in the atmosphere, but also in the soil itself. So if the soil doesn't have enough oxygen in it because it's too tightly compacted or it's really poor quality soil, you're going to get problems there as well. Or if it's just kind of too blocked in where it can't actually get air from the atmosphere, that'll also cause these problems with dieback and poor growth and overall decline in health. And again, soil is very important because it'll cause similar problems with dieback and poor growth and overall decline in health if you have really, really crappy soil. So that's also something that that also requires its own topic. And when it comes to kind of resolving improper care issues, when it comes to adequate sunlight, easy fix, you basically need to put it in the right place. So make sure it's in a place that's appropriate for its sunlight needs, pruning regularly to make sure the plant's not getting blocked by something else or it's blocking itself from actually being able to reach that sunlight. Watering, making sure that you're actually watering to the right level, which we'll try to help you with in this workshop, because if it's too soggy or dry, that's also a problem. Also, when it comes to air, again, avoiding soil compaction, so like pressing down on it to the point where the roots can't breathe, doing good soil practices, again, a whole workshop on that by making sure you're turning the soil, adding compost, lots of good nutrients to that, and again, pruning, again, so that it gets some airflow. And again, soil has its own kind of needs when it comes to making sure that you have the right nutrient balance, you're not planting so much in the same spot that it's stripping the soil of everything that it needs to grow. And also making sure it's aerated, has good drainage. So just making sure you have a good soil profile to make sure your plants are happy. So to dive into these things a little bit more in depth. So the most important thing that you can do to avoid problems is making sure you do right plant in the right place. Because no matter how much care you put into it, if you put a plant in some place that it's not happy, it's not going to do well. And I see this a lot with people, trying to put full sun tomato plants like in the back, like shady patio area and wondering why it doesn't produce, right? So just avoiding those hassles by actually making sure you read the requirements for the plant that you're trying to take care of. So my number one recommendation when you have a plant is, those little like plant label tags that come when you buy a seedling or something like that, actually read it before you throw it away, or even Google the plant species, right? So I want to see, hey, how do you grow a tomato, right? Because you need to be looking for, number one, its sunlight requirements. Like, hey, is this a plant that needs like 8 hours of sun a day, or does it actually prefer being in the shade? So making sure that you're putting it in a place that'll be happy. And the next thing too, and I hate to pick on the farm for that, but if you look at the photo to the right, that's an example of not looking at the spacing requirements before planting something. So this is an example of, these cute little pumpkin seeds that, people started planting all in a row really close to each other, not thinking about, okay, so when a pumpkin gets big, how much space does that one plant need, right? So then you get into these issues where you have this mega vine trying to grow on top of all of these other mega vines that are literally like 6 inches away when it actually needed 6 feet. So avoiding a lot of the issues by actually looking at those spacing requirements. And again, watering requirements, because some plants don't need as much and some plants do. Some plants have deeper roots. So actually making sure you're watering appropriate to what that plant needs will help you go a long way with making sure your plants are healthy. And also another thing too, there are general climates, right? So in Southern California, we can grow pretty much everything because we have a fairly mild climate, not crazy winters. We don't have to really deal with frost all that often. But there are also microclimates. So microclimates are things that are like locally in your immediate garden, things that are changing the normal climate for whatever reason. So a good example is, you're planting on the side of your house and you don't realize that your wall is actually blocking all the sunlight. So right underneath that wall, it's super shady. So even though you live in a full sun, warm climate, that plant's not getting enough sunlight for its needs. Same thing with there happens to be a tree in your yard that kind of like blocks the sun at particular times of the day. So is that being factored into where you're placing your plant? And also local terrain. Sometimes even, you're in Southern California and it should be warm. You might live in a valley where there's tons of fog and mist that makes it cooler than the average area around you. So keeping in mind your environment when you're planting helps a lot in terms of determining where you want to put your plants to make sure that they're happy in the long run. So once you put your plant in the right place, the next thing it needs is water, right? And there's a whole science behind how people calculate watering, how much water a plant actually needs. There's actually a whole scientific explanation for this, which is actually available on our docent training. But I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version because it does require a lot of calculations and things like that. And most people use a rule of thumb anyway. But generally, the idea is that any plant needs water to quote unquote breathe. And as they use that water, they're consuming it, right? It evaporates. And then so that evapotranspiration rate represents the regular water loss that needs to be replenished for that plant to keep going, right? Just the same way you breathe, you need to have that supply going. And what that's based on is generally your climate. So if you look at this map here on the right, you can kind of see where we are, where, obviously on the coast, it's a lot cooler, so you don't need as much water, to be happy. You get kind of into our region where it's a little bit drier, so you might need a little more water there. You start getting inland and it gets really warm, and you kind of have these zones where you're in hotter and drier climates. So obviously you need more water to replace the water more frequently, or more of it to make sure that that plant is happy, because it's basically like sweating. Right. So you need to make sure that you're adjusting for where you're planting, right? So growing something in the desert is going to need a lot more water than growing something on the coast, just logic. And there's all databases and things like that, and various maps. There's USDA maps. There's different maps that can show you. But once you kind of get a sense for what your region is, it's kind of similar, right? So just keeping that distance in mind. And there's and a lot of people use inches of water as a reference. So as a rule of thumb, 0.62 gallons is the equivalent of an inch of water. So for a square foot, 0.62 gallons is the equivalent of 1 inch. So it says hey, you need an inch of water a week. That means you need 0.62 gallons of water on that square foot to keep it happy. So in case that's useful, sometimes they use that measurement or not, but I'll give you some rules of thumb so you don't have to think about it as well. And also on top of your region, different plants use different amounts of water as well. They're just designed differently, right? So when we're talking about the typical edibles, right? So the tomatoes and the basil and the, the nice crop things that we like to eat, they're pretty sensitive and they need a lot of water. So, so the most water consuming thing you can plant is turf. So that's why everyone says, get rid of turf. It's really water consuming because it's very thirsty plant. So edibles are very similar in that category, where it's hey, if you're trying to plant something, this is going to need the most water of any plant. Is just those the really sensitive edibles, the turf, the things that are really lush and green. Now, when it comes to things that are a little bit more hardy, so things that are established fruit trees, so trees that have been there for a long time, they have a really deep root structure, they can get down into the water table, shrubs and things which also have really deep roots, really long-lived plants, they generally don't need as much. So they're about half of that water requirement. So if you have a nice bush that's been there for a long time, it probably doesn't need as much water as your super sensitive tomato plant that's going to die if you don't give water regularly. And on the very lowest end of the spectrum, so about a third of that water consumption is usually native plants. So these are plants that have adapted for this environment. They're used to whatever the rainfall patterns are. So generally they're really low maintenance because they don't need a ton of water to keep going because they're adapted to this environment. So those are all also something that you factor in when you're deciding how much water to give something. And in terms of what a plant has available to them, so they have their own genetic components of how much water they need, but it's also determined by their soil quality. So if the soil's really sandy and it doesn't retain water well, it's just going to drain through, and so they don't have access to as much water. Also, when you're talking about root depth, which is really important, and I'll demonstrate how important that is. Basically, the deeper the roots go, the more moisture they have access to, so they don't need to be watered as frequently. And that's generally what determines the values of how much water needs to be replenished and how often, is that root depth, that soil quality, and then so that's things that you factor in. So again, when it comes to soil, if you have really crappy, sandy soil, it needs to be watered more frequently just because it just drains through really fast. If you have soil that's very clayey, it really hangs on to water, then obviously it's going to get soggy really easily, so you don't need to water as often either. If you're just dealing with the basic potted soil, from Home Depot or whatever, it's generally good soil. So it hangs on to water really, really well. So it's hey, it's good quality. It's not going to drain out the second I put it in. So So it's pretty good at hanging on to water as well. And again, it's really important to understand the length of roots because when you have a little baby plant, it needs a lot more water than something huge like a tree that has a super deep root structure. And people, so I like to use the straw analogy, and I feel like people look at me like I'm crazy because they can't visualize what that looks like. So we're actually going to do a demonstration right now. So root depth really does affect how often you need to water. So hopefully you can pin my video and see what I'm doing. But basically I have 2 straws here, right? So this is a glass of water. Now visualize with me that this short straw is a seedling, right? So this is just a little baby plant that only started life a few days ago. It's just starting to have its roots emerge into the soil. And then you have this more established plant, right? So this plant's been around, it's much older, it's got nice deep root structure. So basically visualize the level of this water glass as being the level of the soil, right? So if I'm this little tiny seedling plant and I start using my roots to draw up the water out of the soil, this is what happens, right? So I'm gonna take a sip. So I drank that much and I'm out, right? My roots don't go any deeper, so I can't access anything below this point. So if no water comes to me, I'm gonna dry up and die. Versus this plant, which I'll actually demonstrate now. So I got to chug all of that water basically because I have this super deep root structure. So I can keep pulling that moisture from the soil because I have all this additional length reaching in and basically drawing up that moisture. So I don't need a top off as soon as this guy does because I have that deeper root structure. So that's why you can get away with watering trees once a month versus if you're trying to plant something from a seed, it needs water every couple of days, right? So that's the big difference when it comes to root depth. So hopefully that visualization was a little bit helpful in terms of understanding how that works for plants. So again, there's a lot of science behind the watering, but basically rule of thumb is that if you, and this is a really good tip from our very first original urban farm intern who works at a nursery. But basically she said like, hey, if you put your finger into the first 2 inches of soil and it's still wet, you don't need to water again. That means that underneath the soil, there's plenty of moisture. Those plants are going to be happy. And you don't want to overwater either, because that causes, again, those issues like mildew and the roots rotting and all sorts of problems, right? So you just want to make sure, hey, the soil is pretty moist. We're good. I don't need to water again. And obviously there are changes, right? So when it's summertime or there's a really big heat event, your plants are going to need more water. If it's cool and it's winter and it's like not as hot, then you're obviously going to need a lot less. And again, that root idea. So if you have very shallow, short roots because you have a very young plant, a very tiny plant, something that's not super well established with the deep root structure, you're going to have to water that more frequently until it gets a deeper root base so that it can access that water. And again, something with super deep roots like a tree or a shrub is going to have a lot more access to water, but so they don't need water as frequently, but they do want it to be deeper so that all of the root structure can get access to that water. So if you compare that to a tree, sometimes you're watering for 15-20 minutes because you're trying to make sure it gets all the way down to the bottom of the soil where the bottom of the roots are. And as general rules of thumb in our region, usually it's around watering is around 2 to 3 times a week for edibles, obviously less if it rains, and about once a week for natives if you want them looking super lush all the time, though obviously they can go longer without it, right? So they can put up with a lot of abuse because they're adapted to this region, but if you want them to look very pretty, generally it's about once a week or once every 2 weeks, and they're pretty happy. So with those rules of thumb, again, use the check, keep an eye on your plants, make sure they're happy, use that finger in the first 2 inches of soil to kind of guide your watering. And in general, good practice is to try to water mornings or evenings where it's not the middle of the day and the sun's shining down on you, because that gives more water, the more time to soak in as opposed to evaporating right away as soon as it hits the plant. And another thing too is that when you're watering, you don't want to just water the leaves. They don't get anything out of it at the leaf point. You want to focus the watering at the roots themselves because that's where they're picking up the water. An additional note about that is that you want to avoid mildew issues, because if you just splash a plant like it's a shower, frequently every couple of days, it's going to start developing like little soft spots and mildew issues. So that's something something you want to keep in mind. And I actually see that question, does watering at the leaves cause mildew? Yes, it does. So if you're just like kind of spraying like this, instead of actually like trying to focus down at the roots, like the leaves will kind of absorb a lot of the moisture, and that's what opens them up to fungus and bacteria and damage. So that's what you want to avoid on that. And then, so that brings me to the next topic, which is pruning. So another tool in your arsenal is being able to prune when you have problems. And I know a lot of people have hangups about cutting plants, like they kind of like are afraid of hurting the plant, or they want to like, like they're not sure what to do and they want to cut wrong. So hopefully this little demonstration will help you. But generally, rules of thumb on how do you prune is that you cut at an angle and avoid the main stem shooting up from the ground. So I'll show you that in a little bit, but obviously you don't want to cut the whole plant down like it's a tree. You just want to cut like at the side leaves that are bothering you or growing in the wrong direction. And again, pruning is not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually pretty essential for some plants. And it helps remove the debris. It helps remove like overcrowding in leaves and branches that don't need to be there. And to make you feel better about trimming, it's a lot like trimming hair, right? So if you trim your hair, you're not going to die, right? It's kind of like trimming like nails or something like that. It's just like an excess like part of the body. Obviously you don't want to like shave the whole thing, but a little cleanup actually helps stimulate the growth on the plant. And you also want to limit the pruning to leaves that are actually like diseased, or they're dead, or they're bringing the whole plant down. Or if it's growing in a direction that you don't want it to go, right? If it's like shooting over the fence, or it's like going into the ground, or like someplace that you don't want it to go that direction, it's easier to prune early so that it'll start redirecting to where you want it to go. And also there's also something called bolting. So a lot of people make this mistake with like basil or cilantro or like herbs, right? Because for herbs, you want the leaves. You don't want the flowers, because the second it goes into flowering mode, it just like kind of drains all the flavor and just goes into reproduction mode, and you don't get anything out of it. So basically, to prevent that, you actually have to cut the flowers before they emerge, so that the plant continues to direct its growth to the leaves only, because that's the part you're harvesting. That's the part you care about. And another reason you prune is like, there's also, especially I see this in tomato plants a lot, where they just get mongo, right? Like there's huge and they're like overflowing, and there's just like, it's getting so dense that it's actually blocking the leaves underneath its own body, so that everything below that isn't getting the nutrients it needs. And then so the whole like bottom of the plant starts dying off. So pruning is an essential task in terms of a technique that's actually very useful. So it is okay to cut off, per the question, dry parts of leaves. It's okay to cut off leaves. Like they're not going to die if you keep it reasonable. And in general, how much is too much, right? So there's generally a third rule. So you don't want to take off more than 30% of the whole leaf structure at once. So, space it out over time, and try not to take more than a third at a time. And also you want to cut from the bottom up or on the sides. You don't want to cut necessarily from the top down, because that's where most of the sunlight is, unless you're cutting off the flower, like I was mentioning, because you're trying to prevent bolting in that leaf. So that's a lot of theory. So I'm actually going to do another demonstration, our second one. So I actually pulled this from my avocado tree this morning. And so don't feel bad. This is actually the leaf, right? So this was actually a stem that was growing off of, like in a weird direction. It was like off the base of the trunk, and it was trying to like go into the dirt. So it's totally useless, right? Like I don't need this branch. But theoretically, if this was a nice plant that I'm trying to keep going, I'll turn on the light there so you can see it. Like if this was growing straight and I wanted to keep this plant, a good place to cut would actually be like these side leaves, right? So you can see where it kind of, this is the main stem here up front. Hopefully you can see that. So this is the main thick stem. So I want to keep that as much as possible, because that's where the plant, like that's the main part of the plant, that's the body. But these little side leaves like this, they're not as essential. So I can cut up to a third of these without really impacting the growth of the plant. And if you look at some of these leaves, like, some of these are, dead, they're dying, they're diseased. So I want to get rid of these, right? So they don't help my plant. They're bringing the whole plant down. So I want to make sure I keep this, get rid of these guys. So basically when you're doing that, hopefully you can see what I'm doing here. If you can pin my video, that'll be helpful. So I'm coming in at an angle, right? And the reason you do an angle, it's kind of like cauterizing a wound. If you chop straight down like an axe, it's harder for the plant to seal that patch up, and then opens up a hole for insects, diseases, and things like that. So it's better to go at an angle like this. And when I snip down, you can see I separated it off. where it's just the, it's going to be perfectly fine. It'll seal up, and that's basically how you prune. And then so you can actually go through the rest of the sides, clean it up at the bottom. And you can actually see where the nice new growth is. It's up on top, right? Because that's where it was getting the most sunlight. So basically, if you leave that top area alone, kind of focus on these sides, pruning is perfectly fine for the plant, and it'll actually appreciate the growth and come back stronger than ever. So so just trim to leaf. Hopefully you apply that same technique for your gardens as well. So don't be afraid to prune is basically my takeaway for that, because it is a useful tool in your arsenal. Let's see. Actually, for the last question that came up, if you're going to be cutting more than half the plant, just spread it out over a day or a couple days that week, right? So you can come back to pruning where it's like, okay, let me get rid of the worst leaves, but not taking more than 30% or a third of all the leaves that are on this plant, and then, let it recover for a week or a few days, come back to get rid of the rest of the diseased leaves, because it's actually an ongoing process, because throughout the season, you might have like branches that die off, leaves that die off, things like that. So it's just something that you continually do over time. So hopefully that helps. And generally, all of these techniques are the idea, with all plants, if you respond and act quickly, it's a good way to save your plant and make sure that you're bringing them back to a healthy state, because you want them to be resilient, which actually helps with the next part of our troubleshooting, because when it comes to all plants, we can attribute issues we see in plants to the four main issues. So that being pathogens, abiotic factors, insects and pests, and then what we just covered, which is improper care. So that's the stuff that we can control because, hey, we didn't quite take care of this, right? And especially if you don't take care of your plant, it makes them very susceptible to the pathogens, abiotic factors, and insects and pests, which we're going to get into now. So do what you can to take care of your plant, put it in the right place, water it well, prune it, make sure it's happy, and then your chance of success against these other factors is a lot higher. So to jump into what each of these are, so when I say pathogens, it's an example of a biotic factor. So this is something that's alive, right? Like viruses, bacteria, things like that. They're basically pathogens or viruses that affect the plant's overall health and appearance. Like it's basically sick, right? And then proper growing conditions will help mitigate that. So making sure it has proper light, humidity, air circulation, and water will help prevent the plant from getting sick, essentially. And if you don't meet those conditions, right, you make it too wet, it's not getting enough light, it weakens them and it makes them more susceptible to those pathogens. And any disease that kind of spreads over time is most likely caused by a pathogen because, that plant is gradually weakening. And here's a few examples of that. So if you garden a lot, you kind of maybe have seen like these, fungal diseases like this, where, you have this beautiful bell pepper, but suddenly it's starting to, like gray up and kind of like form these weird, like rotting spots. So that's a good example of a fungal disease, right? So this is something that's in the soil. It tends to attack when the weather's super wet. Like I was saying, too much moisture can also cause problems, right? So this is an example of one of those things where maybe it was watered too much, or maybe it was just too cool, and it just made that plant vulnerable to that fungal attack. Similarly with tomato plants, right? Fusarium wilt is a really common one. That's just something that's in the soil that attacks, a lot of plants in the nightshade family, including tomatoes, eggplants, peppers. And basically it enters through the roots and then just starts interfering with the water conducting vessels of that plant. So that's why soil, again, is its own workshop, because it's really important to get good, clean soil and not plant the same thing in the same spot that makes them vulnerable to these kinds of attacks. And leaf spots, again, so we've all seen this too, right? Where there's like little disease infections that are caused by bacteria or fungi, and it's basically like any other disease, right? It weakens the plant, and basically causes these defects, right? And the way that you really deal with pathogens is by preventing in the first place. So when you properly care for your plant, plants that are healthy, just like anyone else, right? If you're naturally very healthy, you're less likely to get sick, right? Versus like if you're perpetually struggling, you're weak, basically, right? So those pathogens are more likely to attack you. Pruning, again, is very important, right? So if you see a disease taking over a particular leaf, cut that off. Make sure it doesn't have a chance to spread to the rest of the plant, right? As I was mentioning, crop rotation. So if you plant the same thing in the same spot every single year, the soil will build up those pathogens because it's going to be attracted to that plant. Like, ooh, this is a tomato plant that shows up every single year. So diseases that love tomato plants are going to be like, this is the spot to get my food, right? So then they start building up in those particular families, right? So if you plant something from the nightshade family, maybe mix it up and plant something from the brassica family, right? So, instead of planting tomatoes, maybe try Brussels sprouts one year. Try to mix it up and keep the pathogens guessing. Companion planting is actually our next workshop. So when you have a diversity of plants, it helps ensure that they're not attracting kind of the same diseases, the same pests that help spread those pathogens. So it makes it less likely that they're all going to get taken out by the same disease, and actually help each other be stronger and help them be more resistant. Again, using clean and healthy soil is really important to make sure you're not bringing in diseased soil that already has these pathogens hanging out. And again, avoiding overwatering. So again, many pathogens really thrive in those moist conditions. So it's important to, make sure you're not overwatering and causing those really moist conditions for that. So the second category of diseases are abiotic. So these are non-living factors, like they're not alive, and they can impact plants just as much as living biotic factors like insects and pathogens can. So weather is the main abiotic factor that has the ability to inhibit plant health and destroy crops. So, and if plant damage that doesn't really spread, it's probably caused by something that just in the environment, it's an abiotic disease. Abiotic diseases can include physiological changes, so for example, if there's like an extreme temperature change one night, wind, hail, excessive rain, drought, even chemical burn, exposure to air pollutants, things that really affect the whole garden, it can actually cause physiological changes. So some physical signs that the plants are suffering from some sort of abiotic disease or condition are generally stunted growth and crown dryback. So for example, this is, what drought and heat damage looks like on the left, and then also excessive cold damage on the right. A good example too is that some people wonder like, oh, why is my squash plant suddenly dying back? And it's like, well, if it's actually getting into fall and this is a summer plant, like you're probably going to see a lot of this, right? So it's like, no matter what you do, you can't force a plant to kind of survive outside of its weather. That's also something, if you're seeing things like that, it might be time to switch over. So that's basically what abiotic factors look like. And basically solutions to this, if it's not something that's under complete control like season, adjusting watering and care to the actual weather conditions. So for example, if you have a really extreme hot, like 100-degree heat day, it's good to make sure that you water extra, right? Because you realize that's a change in the environment. Also, if you have super sensitive plants that, really don't like the cold, right? You can actually bring them in and make sure they're protected during that extreme weather event. Also things like, putting up a clear tarp over your plants temporarily just to protect them from hail and crazy windstorms and things like that can help. And basically just taking extra care of them after an extreme weather event. And most plants are pretty resilient, so they will bounce back if you take extra good care of them after something like that. And for the insects, so the next most popular, so if you have something delicious in your garden, you can almost guarantee that an insect is going to want to eat it, right? So managing insects is a very important step when it comes to, you work so hard to develop like this nice, beautiful plant that's going to feed, provide a crop. You got to make sure things don't eat it. Before you kind of like get paranoid about, oh, all insects are terrible, there's actually beneficial insects as well. So there are beneficial insects, there's harmful insects. Some harmful insects include slugs, cutworms, Japanese beetles, aphids, white grubs, but there's also beneficial insects like pollinators and things like that. And usually you can tell whether an insect is damaging your plants because it's usually determined by the types of holes they're leaving behind. So it's almost like putting together a crime scene, right? So if you find a bunch of holes in the leaves and things like that, you can find little weird patterns and tunnels, chewed edges. That generally is a sign that there's an insect hanging in your garden and really enjoying your plants, right? So what do you do at that point? And in terms of kind of controlling for insects, a little ounce of prevention goes a long way. So simple practices such as removing plant residue where the insects like to live from the previous year's garden, making sure you have a clean slate is helpful. Also regularly monitoring your plants. So, just make sure that hey, an insect hasn't decided to set up camp on top of your plants and they're not like munching away. And getting to stuff early definitely helps when it comes to an insect infestation because they will multiply and they will start going for your plant once they know it's there. And a good way to get rid or control the insect population is relying on integrated pest management techniques, which is actually coming up next. So And this is an example of, leaf damage from an insect, and you can kind of see this indicates that there's a presence of insects like, aphids, scales, spider mites, whiteflies, things that like to climb in, even caterpillars, like anything that likes to munch on the leaves themselves. And the reason why this looks different than, some of the abiotic or, pathogens and things like that, is if you look at the pattern, you can see it's very irregular. Like it literally looks like someone took a bite out of certain parts of the plant, and it's very ragged, it's uneven, the holes are different sizes. That's a good indicator that some insect is basically having your plant for lunch. So when you see damage like that, you can kind of tell that it's an insect. And also different insects will make different patterns based on the size of their teeth, or the way that they burrow into the leaf. So again, Google's your best friend when it comes to identifying specific pests, but generally seeing something like this is a sign that insects are coming for your plants. So this brings us to pest management. So what is integrated pest management? It's basically a method for managing and preventing pests in a way that doesn't harm people or the environment. So instead of immediately going to nuke the garden with every chemical we got, we actually look at some other ways to try to control that pest population. And a pest doesn't necessarily need to be an insect. Like they actually come in all shapes and sizes. It could be anything from a small insect to a large mammal, like the rabbits that we have at the farm, or the raccoons that are eating all your fruit trees, things like that. Like it can actually be larger animals as well. But there's many types of integrated pest management, but we're basically focusing on 4 kind of general methods. So there's cultural methods, there's biological method, there's mechanical controls, and chemical controls are kind of the last resort, right? But there's still responsible ways to do that as well. So in terms of preference for integrated pest management, generally, you want to start with cultural controls. So these are mostly preventative measures that help manipulate the environment in order to reduce the risk of pests and stressors on the plants themselves. So again, it goes back to that proper care technique, right? So making sure the soil is nice and prepared, it's got lots of nutrients. You're weeding regularly to make sure there's not little clusters of weeds that attract pests and things like that near your actual crop. Selecting plants that are actually naturally resistant to pests, and or even planting them near other plants that need that protection. Example, companion planting, which we're actually going to cover in next week's workshop. Also, again, regular crop rotation. So not planting the exact same thing in the exact same place every single year will help kind of keep the insects guessing, or the pests guessing, so that they don't rely on that as oh, this is the spot where I can get good tomatoes, right? Like you want to keep them kind of guessing on that. And also interplanting a variety of species as well to kind of help mix things up, because certain pests are attracted to certain plants. So if you make sure there's kind of like a mini ecosystem going on, it helps make sure that you're not attracting all the same pests in the same spot by planting the same thing. And it also starts off again with right plant, right place, just really careful crop planning and maintenance. So for example, at the farm, we actually plan out our crops by season, where we make sure we're featuring companion planting, interplanting, making sure the crops are rotated so we're not planting the same thing in the same beds every single year. So every season, the bed will feature some type of different plant family. It's not the same kind every single season. And that's to help prevent, again, those pests. And also seasonal soil prep, again, keeping that soil healthy so the plants are healthy will help deter pests as well. And biological controls is another type of control where you're actually creating your own mini ecosystem by introducing beneficial predators. So like ladybugs are a really common example, and you're basically trying to manage or ward off more harmful pests by introducing them into the garden. And ways that you can do that is not necessarily like, oh, I need to mail order a ladybug. You can actually just do that by establishing plants that they like. So again, it's that idea of companion planting or thinking about, hey, this plant is really susceptible to this. Let me plant something else that attracts the predator of that pest, right? And also, again, not going straight for the Roundup, right? Like not nuking everything in your garden because you found a bug. It's like by avoiding pesticides, you can actually help introduce pollinators and useful insects instead of just broad-based trying to get, nuke every single insect you find in your garden, because in the long run, it's actually healthier to have a natural kind of relationship here. And you can, again, release helpful insects like ladybugs or praying mantises, but just make sure you're not accidentally releasing an invasive species into your garden and causing your own problems. So, so you use that judiciously. At the farm, we also try to incorporate organic-ish gardening. So it's not organic because we don't pay the $10,000 fee to use USDA to be certified organic, but we try to use organic principles. So, we try to use natural pest control materials, avoiding synthetic chemical pesticides, trying to build up this local ecosystem of pollinators and native plants to help, keep those pests in check. So that's things that we integrate when it comes to those three. And finally, there's also physical mechanical control. So the purpose of mechanical controls is where you're actually physically providing a barrier between pests and your plants. So that's extremely helpful when you're dealing with larger pests, such as rabbits and gophers, which attack the farm mercilessly. So basically, the only thing that's going to keep a rabbit out is if you physically block them out, right? So examples of physical or mechanical controls is, if you've got lots of bugs and aphids, literally just spraying them off with the hose, making sure they're just off of the leaf is an easy way to get rid of them, right? Also removing insects and insect eggs. So if you see little eggs laid on your leaves, just pull them off so that they're not, just hanging out and forming this huge colony, right? Fences and netting are really useful. So if you have bird netting, that can keep the birds out of your fruit and things like that, or, larger flying insects and things like that, bunnies and whatnot. Mulching is also good for suppressing weeds and things like that, where other insects like to live. There also is the option that this also traps technically fall under this, but some are use that with cautions and some are inhumane, or others might attract additional pests. And some people, if you're dealing with kind of larger animals, will sometimes put scarecrows or fake owls to try to trip out the animals that are trying to come in and take stuff from your garden. So there's a variety of mechanical controls also when it comes to trying to take care of that. For the farm specifically, if you've ever visited, we have these nice PVC cages, which are actually designed to keep and netting to physically block the rabbits and rodents from getting in. And you can also install wire netting on the ground to help prevent rodents from digging under the beds. So there's actually a wire mesh under all the raised beds too, to make sure that they're not digging up into the bed and accessing it that way, because they are pretty persistent. This is also an example of another integrated pest management type of control. So if you've never heard of diatomaceous earth, it's kind of a interesting product because basically it's it's sand almost, but it's basically microscopically small and sharp, diatoms. So they're these little hard shelled mini microscopic crustaceans. And then so when they die and dry out, they form this really almost little slivers of glass almost. And then so on, it doesn't really hurt people, but when you sprinkle it on the ground around your plant, insects don't want to crawl over that because it'll actually cut them up and cause them to die. So they'll actually avoid crawling over it. So they'll stay away from your plants. And that's just an example of a physical control that you're using to block them from wanting to come around on your plant. And it must be dry to work. So don't try to do this when it's raining or anything, but it's a nice little barbed wire barrier around your plants without having to harm anything or rely on chemicals. Which brings me to chemicals. So chemicals have their place. They're useful for preventing and killing pests, but non-synthetic and natural pesticides and herbicides should be used over things that are super toxic, super synthetic, and damaging to the environment. So examples of things that can be chemical controls are things like vinegar, cornmeal, diluted soap and water is really good. Sometimes you can use vegetable oil, peppermint oil, neem oil. So basically it's a way of physically making the plant difficult for that insect to crawl up on, or it makes it really a nuisance to them, right? So peppermint oil, neem oil, it's really strong smelling, so they don't want to be near it, right? Same thing with vinegar, and versus cornmeal or dish soap and water makes the surface really difficult to climb, so then they'll try to avoid that as well. Just make sure you apply any chemicals you do use only to the affected areas. You don't want to go crazy and just try to spray it everywhere. And make sure it's diluted to the proper ratio on the back of the label, just to make sure you're not burning your plants with over application of any chemicals that you use. So a common chemical solution that we use is just the water and dish soap option at the farm. Really simple. Again, eco-friendly dish soap, couple squirts of that, some water. And if you spray that on the leaves, it actually makes the leaf physically slippery, as as well as makes it taste bad to the plant, to the insect as well. So it helps keep them off, and it's just soap and water, right? So you can, it doesn't really affect the quality of your plant or hurt anything. Similarly, white vinegar and water is also a similar combination. Again, it's just a very disruptive taste to the insect to kind of make it unappealing. And it's actually a great cleaning solution. So you can actually use water and vinegar to like help wipe down surfaces as well. So it's kind of like a nice little multi-purpose cleaning solution that's eco-friendly and easy to make. And finally, our favorite. So when all else fails and we really need to bring out the big guns, we're a big fan of neem oil. So neem oil is there's a type of tree called neem, and basically it's the oil from that tree. It basically acts as like in everything. So it actually helps repress fungus. It helps confuse insects. It disrupts insect development, but it's still like it's tea tree, right? So it's not like a crazy synthetic, chemical. So we actually use that as part of our organic gardening methods to help, we dilute it with water and then spray it to the affected leaves if it's experiencing some kind of fungal growth, like if it's getting attacked by insects, things like that. So it's a good all around for helping prevent that. So with that, we'll actually do our opportunity drawing first, and then we'll get into Q&A. So hopefully you enjoyed that session, you were paying attention. So per past workshops, we will actually be doing this via the chat. So I have Chloe on board to check who gets the correct answer for this. And this week's prize is actually a home herb garden kit. So if you win, we'll actually mail this to your house via Amazon. So in the next second or two, I'm going to show you a leaf and you have to tell me what caused the damage. So what caused the damage to this leaf? A, it was a fungal bacterial infection, or B, it was insects. So showing now. What does that look like to you? Type it into the chat. And Chloe, let me know when we have a winner.
Case is the one that answered first.
Of course. Case is on a roll. Okay, so I guess Case, you're a winner this week. Chloe, if you can message Case with the club Gmail, and then we can get that address.
Awesome, sounds good.
Thank you. And we will be doing opportunity drawings next week as well. So if you didn't win this time, we'll make sure that we, you'll have your chance next week as well. So I guess with that, that pretty much concludes the main topics today. So I will be opening up to question and answer at this time. So I'll even stop sharing so that we can take a look at the chat. So Chloe, I know you are hopefully wrapping up that message, but did any questions come in through the chat that you wanted me to address first? I guess there's a lot of questions, so I guess I can try to do that second. Okay, so I'll just go look through where I can. If anyone has additional questions, feel free to chop them up. Let's see. So I think I got to the point. Next question, is it possible to cut rose stems to keep them healthier for longer? I heard some people do that for indoor bases. So actually that technique I showed you of cutting at an angle, so instead of like straight on, will actually help the plant continue to absorb nutrients and seal up. So that actually helps them survive a little bit longer versus like being hacked off at the root. 1/3 rule just means 1/3 of the leaves. So try not to take more than 1/3 of all the leaves on the plant when you're pruning. Is it okay to cut the dry parts of the plant? Yeah, like I think we addressed that question, separated out. What conditions should be met in order to prevent a pathogen attack? You basically keep your plant healthy is what the timing works out. And how many times should you water your plant? Again, it's usually 2 to 3 times a week if you're in our region, and you're dealing with edible, once a week if it's something that's drought tolerant. Why do leaves slowly die off if the plant is thriving? It depends on the plant, but some plants naturally just shed leaves as they grow new ones. So just because a leaf is dying doesn't necessarily mean that's the end of the world. So depending on how the plant is doing, and it might just be a natural shedding of the leaves. Should you water once a day or once a week? Again, depends on the plant. So there are very few plants that actually need water every single day. So it's generally only a couple of times a week. Insects. So didn't really understand that question. What are minor tunnels? So minor tunnels are basically where there's like a particular type of insect that likes to actually go through the leaf surface. So have you ever seen those kind of wavy lines on a leaf? That's actually a minor leaf tunnel. So it's just basically, it's a bug that's in there that's actually rolling around eating your leaf. Insects generally are not scared by any frightening things. They're more afraid of the they're more reactive to taste and things like that. Water and vinegar. So yeah, so I think then it was opportunity drawing. What is a beginner friendly plant to own? I'd probably say something depending on your light conditions, probably like an herb of some kind, because they last a long time. They're pretty easy to harvest, and once they're kind of like happy, they're generally more shrub-like, so they don't really require as much care. So I'd probably say that. Let's see. Any other questions at this point? We have additional Q&A time. So what's my favorite plant to own? So I think in terms of favorites, pretty much anything I like to eat. So like I make the mistake every single year where I'm like, oh, okay, I should get a tomato plant going. And then I get this massive harvest and realize I actually don't like tomatoes that much. And I'm like, so this year I've been trying to like avoid doing that. So, just trying to keep things that are pretty good. I had a couple Brussels sprouts that did really well, and like, yeah, I had some good harvests out of that. Squash, things like that. So that's actually been really good. The squash plants have been super productive, great to eat, definitely worth it in terms of that value. So I highly encourage anyone who's looking at plants to just think about what you like to eat when it comes to edible gardening, and then the rest you can kind of do the research for. And yes, we have tons of rabbits at the university. So we have had multiple harvest crops go down because rabbits have decided that the farm's a delicious place to get a meal. So yes, there are a lot of rabbits. So yeah, and then so I think that's it for questions that have come through. I think I've addressed them all. I'm actually going to stop the recording and stay on for a few more minutes for questions, and then if we don't see any, we can wrap up. So thanks.